All right, stand by. 10 seconds to go.
Talent.
Ready, camera.
Three,
Cue talent.
2, 1.
Roll for record.
Juvenile delinquent who doctors didn't want to give a heart transplant to, but whose mom cried racism until they did, is dead after a shooting, carjacking, home invading crime spree. I'm John Phillips, and Hearts for Hooligans is at the top of today's rundown. We're talking about a kid named Anthony Stokes. Here he is, posing with a gun in a picture he posted online. Looks like Stephen Kruiser's senior shot for high school. When he was 15 in the summer of 2013, he was denied a spot on the waiting list for a needed heart transplant just because, advocates said, he was poor, black, and in trouble with the law. Doctors reportedly took into account the fact that he had low grades and had been in juvie to decide he was unlikely to take his meds or follow doctors' orders and therefore wasn't the best candidate for one of the critically limited supply of transplant hearts. Oh, he also had a court-ordered ankle monitor on for what his mother calls, quote, fighting at the time. A week later, and under great pressure from activists, the hospital reversed course, and Stokes went from being rejected for a transplant to being at the top of the list. He got the transplant, and all seemed well, except last week, Anthony Stokes died, but not because his heart gave out. He carjacked a car at a mall, committed a home invasion burglary, fired a shot at an elderly woman while she was calling 911, got into a high-speed chase with the cops, lost control, ran down a pedestrian, and finally hit a pole and was killed in the crash. According to the American Transplant Foundation, more than 123,000 people are waiting for a transplant. Another name is added to the national transplant waiting list every 12 minutes. On average, 21 people die every single day from the lack of available organs for transplant. Joining us from Dallas, Texas to talk about this is PJTV contributor Scott Ott. And here in studio in sunny Los Angeles is stand-up comic Stephen Kruiser. You know, Stephen, whenever you deal with organs and you deal with these transplants, there's a finite amount of organs and a huge number of people. We went through some of the numbers. You have to make calls. You have to make choices. If you're dealing with livers and you have someone who's an alcoholic who's fallen off the wagon any number of times, that person, in my estimation, should be lower on the list than a kid that needs one, or someone who's followed the rules. But they do this all the time. They didn't do this in this case. Were the doctors that initially denied him correct?
Yes, they were. They have clearly defined criteria for making these decisions. Most of them are medically informed. This is not a government thing first. And this is a classic example of it. And this is one of the most worst examples I've seen, actually, of what can happen when we allow an emotional mob to trump legality, you know, the normal things in society. And this is happening more and more lately. In this case, it's very egregious, though. When you let the emotional mob run roughshod over professional people who are doing the right thing, this is the kind of thing that happens. And why on earth would you want to make a violent criminal healthier? I mean, when you just look at it that way, I don't care. They got the three things you listed at the beginning. This is because he's poor, black, and in trouble with the law. The third one is the reason why they were denying him the thing. It had nothing to do with him being poor and black, but that's what they led with when they were screaming injustice, injustice, injustice.
Scott, is this why people just pull their hair out when they hear these cries of racism?
Yeah, and this obviously had nothing to do with racism. It wouldn't matter if the kid was black or white. I mean, what the hospital calls a history of noncompliance led them to believe here's a guy who's not going to do what anybody tells him. And when you get a heart transplant, that's not the end of it. After they cut you open and sew you back up, you've got a lot of stuff that you have to do, and you have to obey the doctor's orders. And here's this guy with a history of saying, screw you, I'm not going to do what you tell me to. You know, the real tragedy here is the person who died who could have had that heart. Because, as you said, there's this huge waiting list for organs of all kinds, and something like 6,000, 6,500 people die every year on waiting lists for those organs. So not only did this kid die who got the heart, but he killed somebody else.
Why is there no sympathy for that person? Because you look at all the players involved in this story, and the person who is most sympathetic is the person that Scott just mentioned. But no one knows that person. No one knows who died. Maybe it's more than one people. Maybe it's many people that died because of this.
You know, one way to illustrate that would be to go back chronologically, find out who the next person who died on the transplant list was, find out their story, and talk about that person. You know, that would be one of the ways to highlight this here. And that is the real tragedy here, is that somebody had to die so that a criminal could waste a heart for a few years. That's basically what happened. Wasted a heart. And not just the person who died. Let's talk about the person who gave his or her heart away, hoping it would probably go to someone who really needed it, and instead that person made a sacrifice that was wasted too.
You know, when you look back at the history of this country in terms of race, we do have some dark spots.
Yes.
You look at what happened to Emmett Till, and that was horrific. Now it seems like the activists who are civil rights activists, in their words, they pick the craziest people to turn into the kid that fell in the well. We saw that happen in Ferguson, Missouri. We're seeing this happen here. Why do they pick the worst possible people to make the Emmett Tills of today?
It's really backwards, because what the larger narrative is that black male youth are unfairly targeted by law enforcement, and then they go out and find the one guy who was deserving of being targeted. You're right. They go out and they find the actual criminals to do that. But one of the reasons is they can get away with it now. They can, especially in the era of Obama. You start screaming racism loud enough, and everybody backs off and capitulates because they're afraid of being called racist. So they do that now because they can.
Scott, why do they pick these people?
Well, and John, I don't think we should forget the role of the media in this. If you go back and watch the original newscast 2 years ago when they interviewed this kid, he was sitting in a hospital room. Okay, now you just showed the pictures of him with a gun, and, you know, we know he was using pot and he was doing all that kind of stuff. Well, the news report had him in a hospital room playing chess. He was actually, you know, playing an intellectual game there, and the news anchor, after they came back from the piece that they did about this kid, talked about what a sad tragedy it was that he was being denied this heart. You know, the news media becomes the engine of misinformation that organizations like, I believe it was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the civil rights group, latched onto and helped this mom to, as Kruiser indicated, not only piss away his own life, but that of another person who could have had that heart.
You know, Kruiser, a federal judge ruled here in California that the state must give a convicted murderer a sex change. Bradley Manning turned over very sensitive documents to the government that could theoretically put lives at risk. Not just one, but many lives at risk, including our national security. We're being forced to pay for a sex change for him. Why is it that we're taking care of the worst among us when we have people who are more deserving, certainly, who maybe even can pay for it, and we're putting them farther down on the list behind these people?
It used to be that criminals had to forfeit their rights. That was part of going to prison. You know, you weren't allowed to vote, you weren't allowed to do this, you weren't allowed to, and now they're supposed to have this right, and it all falls under the guise of not foisting cruel and unusual punishment upon them, and that definition is expanding all the time. So now, if someone wants a sex change, you're punishing them by making them stay trapped in the body, and it all comes back to emotional social justice warrior mob rule. That's what it all falls under, that blanket.
Yeah, and you know what? People just throw their hands up and they say, I'm done. And they tune them out. And you know what? Anyone that took this kid up as a cause that should be celebrated, or a cause that we should get behind, to me, I just don't care what they have to say. I really don't.
And they're banking on that. It's like when a large corporation gets in a legal battle with someone smaller, they just want to wear you out with the legality. They can afford lawyers filing paperwork that will eventually wear you out, and you'll just give up. They're doing the same thing with the social justice warrior stuff.
Scott, should we remember all of the people that were pimping this kid and know in the future to never trust them on anything?
Well, yeah, and I would hope we would have known it already, but unfortunately, companies like hospitals are susceptible to this kind of blackmail, this extortion that these civil rights groups put on them. And, you know, I'm torn with the mother. I mean, what mother doesn't love her son? Everybody, no matter how nefarious and wicked and misbehaving your kid is, you always love your kid, and you always hope that he'll turn around. You know, if I had been in that community and had an opportunity, I probably would have made an effort to help this kid turn around, but I'd say, you know what, I'll tell you what. You come to me week after week to church every Sunday and spend an hour with me afterward talking about Jesus, and then we'll get you on the transplant list, okay?
All right, that's all the time we have for today, but now it's your turn. Was the hospital right to deny the transplant organ to a kid they thought would go bad? Or should doctors not make moral judgments on the sick? Go ahead and tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm John Phillips. Thanks so much for watching The Rundown.